The morning, everything changed. February 28th, 2026. Tehran, Iran, 6:35 UTC. He had done it before. He had stared down revolutions, sanctions, assassinations of his closest allies, and the rage of nations. For nearly 3.5 decades, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei had governed Iran with absolute, iron conviction. The belief that the Islamic Republic would outlast every enemy that rose against it. On the night of February 27th, 2026, he returned to his residential compound in Tehran after delivering a speech to Iran's Security Commission. He was 85 years old. He walked slowly, but his eyes, those quiet and calculating eyes, carried the same certainty they always had. He did not know that 63 kilometers above him, American and Israeli surveillance systems had been tracking his every movement for weeks. He did not know that the night had already been divided into 3 operational windows, each synchronized to the second, each aimed at a different room of the Islamic Republic's inner sanctum. He did not know that by morning, his name would appear in past tense on the front pages of every newspaper in the world. At precisely 6:35 UTC on February 28th, 2026, CENTCOM, the United States Central Command, announced it had begun airstrikes against Iran. The operation was codenamed Operation Epic Fury. Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from U.S. warships in the Arabian Sea. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, invisible to radar, released bunker-busting munitions over fortified ballistic missile facilities. B-1 Lancers and B-52 Stratofortresses, aircraft designed to deliver destruction on an industrial scale, were already overhead. 10 minutes later, the Israeli Air Force began what military analysts would later describe as an unprecedented wave of decapitation strikes. 3 separate gatherings of Iranian regime officials were hit within half a minute of each other. Ali Khamenei, along with members of his family, was killed. Iran's supreme leader, the man who had shaped and defined the Islamic Republic for 36 years, was gone before the sun had fully risen over Tehran. In Washington, it was still the middle of the night. The Situation Room was lit. Trump had given the order to proceed at 20:38 the previous evening, UTC. His administration had spent weeks constructing a legal and strategic architecture to justify what they were about to do. At his State of the Union address just 4 days earlier, on February 24th, Trump had told the American people that Iran had restarted its nuclear program and was developing missiles capable of striking the continental United States. The case, at least in Washington's telling, had been made. But inside Iran, inside the homes and streets and mosques of a nation that had not started this fight, the bombs were not falling on military logic. They were falling on lives, on families, on the fragile and ordinary architecture of daily existence. The war had begun, and nobody, not even those who launched it, could be certain how it would end. The fire that answered fire. February 28th to March 9th, 2026. Tehran, Gulf States, March 9th, 2026. Tehran, Gulf States, Strait of Hormuz. The Islamic Republic had anticipated something. Not this. Not on this scale, not on this night. Not with the precision and simultaneous ferocity that had just been unleashed upon its soil. But whatever shock seized Iran's surviving leadership in the hours after the first strike, they did not collapse. They responded. Within hours of the opening assault, Iran launched retaliatory waves of ballistic missiles and drones, hundreds of them, targeting Israel, U.S. military installations across the region, and the Gulf Arab states that Tehran had long viewed as American proxies. Bahrain was struck. Kuwait, Qatar. The UAE missiles screamed over Jordan. Drones entered Iraqi Kurdistan's airspace. A drone struck the British Akrotiri military base on Cyprus. The message from Tehran to the world was blunt. If you stand with America, you stand in range. But it was one decision above all others that would redefine this war. Not just for the Middle East, but for the entire global economy. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran's southern coast and the Sultanate of Oman, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest, carries roughly 1/5 of the world's entire oil and natural gas supply every single day. On March 1st, 2026, that flow stopped. Ships were turned back. Mines were laid. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy enforced the blockade with gunboats and the threat of worse. By March 9th, only 15 ships had made it through the strait. Shipping insurance rates had increased 4 to 6 times their pre-war levels. Global oil prices, which had been hovering near $70 a barrel just before the war began, surged to over $100 per barrel by March. In the United States, gasoline prices at the pump would eventually rise by more than 50%. In parts of Asia, fuel shortages emerged within weeks. The war was no longer just about Iran's nuclear program or regime change or the assassination of a supreme leader. It had become a war about the economic bloodstream of the modern world. Every tanker frozen in the Gulf of Oman, every barrel of oil rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, every dollar added to a fuel bill in Ohio or London or Mumbai. All of it traced back to this one narrow stretch of water that Iran had, in one calculated act, choked shut. In Tehran, a new supreme leader had been named, Mojtaba Khamenei, the 56-year-old son of the man who had just been assassinated. Yemen's Houthi movement declared his selection a victory. China, carefully watching, noted that the appointment was based on Iran's constitution. Russia offered no condemnation. The world was choosing its corners. And the question that was already being whispered in every capital on earth was the same. How does this end? And who blinks first? Maximum pressure, maximum pain. March to April 7th, 2026, Washington, Islamabad. The Persian Gulf. Donald Trump had been here before, not literally, not with bombs already falling, but strategically, emotionally, temperamentally. He understood leverage. He believed in it with the conviction of a man who had built an empire by understanding when to push and when to pull. And in the early weeks of March 2026, he pushed. On March 6th, Trump posted on Truth Social in plain, unambiguous terms, "There will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender." It was not diplomatic language. It was not meant to be. Inside the Pentagon and the State Department, officials watched the post appear with the quiet resignation of men who had learned not to be surprised. Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, had already called some of Iran's top leaders, in a phrase that raised eyebrows across every foreign ministry in the world, insane in the brain. Meanwhile, U.S. and Israeli forces pressed their advantage. American B-52 bombers began flying over Iranian territory for the first time, a symbolic demonstration of air supremacy as much as a military act. Targets multiplied. Ammunition depots in Isfahan destroyed in vast explosions, air bases degraded, ballistic missile facilities systematically dismantled. By late March, CENTCOM reported that the U.S. military had cumulatively destroyed nearly 2,000 targets inside Iran, 19 ships, 1 submarine, and military infrastructure across the country. On April 13th, Trump escalated again. The U.S. Navy began what officials described as a counter-blockade, preventing ships that had docked at Iranian ports from passing through the Strait of Hormuz. The strategic intent was clear. If Iran was going to strangle the world's oil supply, America would strangle Iran's ability to export its own oil. Iran's storage capacity for exports was projected to reach maximum capacity by May. The pressure was real. The pain was real. But something else was happening too. Pakistan and China had jointly delivered a 5-point peace initiative on March 31st, calling for an immediate end to hostilities and the admission of humanitarian aid. On April 1st, Trump claimed Iran had asked for a ceasefire and said the U.S. would consider it once the strait was open, free and clear. Iran's foreign ministry called the claim false and baseless. The IRGC was equally defiant. The gap between what Washington wanted and what Tehran would accept remained vast. On April 7th, something shifted. A temporary 2-week ceasefire was announced. It was fragile. J.D. Vance called it exactly that. It was incomplete. Trump explicitly excluded Lebanon and Hezbollah from its terms. But it was real enough that guns fell mostly silent across the Gulf for the first time since February 28th. The world exhaled. Not deeply, not fully, but enough to begin, very carefully, talking. The ceasefire that was. Never quite peace. April 8th to April 30th, 2026, Islamabad, Tehran, Washington. A ceasefire is not peace. It is a pause in which both sides catch their breath, count their losses, and decide whether the cost of continuing outweighs the cost of stopping. The ceasefire that took effect on April 8th, 2026, was exactly that. A pause. A brittle, contested, violated pause. Within days, Trump accused Iran of violating the ceasefire numerous times. By April 9th, ships were once again being prevented from moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Israel and America were accused by Tehran of violating the ceasefire themselves through continued strikes in Lebanon. Iranian drones struck Iraqi Kurdistan 16 times in the weeks following the supposed truce. The ceasefire held in name. In practice, it leaked from every seam. In Islamabad, Pakistan was working overtime. The Pakistani Air Force had mobilized JF-17 and F-16 fighters to escort Iranian diplomatic aircraft, their transponders switched off, to the negotiating table. The Pakistanis had built a protective air corridor over the Persian Gulf to allow Iranian representatives to travel safely. It was an extraordinary logistical and diplomatic performance by a country threading a needle between its relationship with Washington and its strategic ties to Tehran. The talks, when they happened, were brutal in their complexity. Iran arrived with a 14-point proposal that one American lawmaker, echoing broader Iranian hardliner sentiment, described as an Iranian wish list. The United States arrived with its own demands. Iran must halt uranium enrichment, must ship its existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium out of the country, must not operate its deep underground nuclear facilities, and must reopen the Strait of Hormuz. In exchange, America would lift sanctions and unfreeze billions in Iranian assets. Tehran was not ready to sign any of it, not because its leadership was irrational, but because within Iran's own power structure, The factions were at war with each other as much as they were at war with America. Hardliners, emboldened by the new supreme leader, wanted to fight. Pragmatists, watching the economy implode and storage tanks filled to bursting, understood the clock was ticking. And the moderate voices, the ones Trump's envoys were quietly trying to empower, were struggling to be heard above the noise of missiles and wounded national pride. By late April, Trump gave Iran 3 to 5 days to engage seriously or face resumed attacks. The deadline passed. The attacks did not resume. The ceasefire, fractured as it was, held for another week. The world watched, and in Islamabad and Tehran and Washington, the papers were revised once more. Project Freedom and the Strait that wouldn't open. May 1st to May 5th, 2026. Strait of Hormuz, Washington, Gulf of Oman. They called it Project Freedom. The name was chosen with the same instinct for branding that had defined the Trump administration's approach to everything. Bold, declarative, impossible to misread. The project's objective was equally blunt. Guide stranded commercial ships out of the Strait of Hormuz and back into open water, breaking Iran's chokehold on global trade through direct American naval escort. It did not go as planned. Iran had, in the chaos of laying its naval mines, apparently lost track of some of them. According to at least one report, Tehran was unable to fully open the strait, even if it had wanted to. The location of its own mines had become uncertain. The mines that were meant to be a weapon of leverage had become a trap of Iran's own construction. The practical and symbolic implications of this were profound. Iran had closed the most important waterway in the world, and then, to a degree, lost control of its own closure. The harder the U.S. pushed Project Freedom and Operation Epic Fury, the more the hardliners in Tehran stood up. American muscle flexing, one regional source later told CNN, was actually strengthening the voices inside Iran that least wanted a deal. Every aggressive posture from Washington gave the IRGC generals and the parliamentary hawks the narrative they needed to resist. The moderates, who understood that Iran's economy was bleeding to death, were being crowded out. By May 5th, Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that the offensive phase, Operation Epic Fury, was over. The administration's full focus, he said, would now shift to Project Freedom and to diplomacy. Iran had already accused the U.S. of violating the ceasefire by entering the strait with warships. The Revolutionary Guard announced they would view the entry of any military vessel near the strait as a breach of the truce. And yet, underneath all of this, something was changing. The Pakistani mediators were sending quiet signals to Washington, not public signals, not official signals, but signals nonetheless. Iran was moving. Slowly, reluctantly, with the stubborn dignity of a nation that had been bombed and blockaded and decapitated of its supreme leader. Iran was moving toward the table. On the American side, Trump was paying attention. He paused Project Freedom on Tuesday, May 5th, citing progress in the negotiations. It was a gesture, small by the scale of what had happened over the previous 67 days. But it was a gesture in the direction of de-escalation. For the first time since February 28th, both sides were at least facing the same door. Whether either would walk through it remained the question that no map, no missile, and no memorandum had yet been able to answer. The one-page document that could end a war. May 6th to May 7th, 2026. Washington, Islamabad. Tehran, 1 page. 14 points. That was all that stood between the continuation of a war that had killed thousands, displaced millions, disrupted the global economy, and reshaped the Middle East, and a framework for something approaching peace. On May 6, 2026, the Axios news organization reported that the White House believed it was getting close to an agreement on a memorandum of understanding with Iran. 2 U.S. officials confirmed it. 2 other sources briefed on the matter confirmed it. It was the closest the 2 sides had been to any agreement since the war began. The document, 14 points on a single page, had been assembled through the work of Trump's special envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, negotiating both directly and through Pakistani intermediaries. In its current form, it would declare an end to the war and trigger a 30-day period of detailed negotiations on Iran's nuclear program, on the unfreezing of Iranian assets, on the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Under its terms, Iran would commit to a moratorium on uranium enrichment. The previous American proposal had demanded 20 years. The current framework was being negotiated downward from that ceiling. Iran would also be required to ship its stockpile of highly enriched uranium out of the country. Trump was publicly optimistic. Speaking to reporters at the White House, he said the U.S. had had very good talks over the past 24 hours. He told PBS News that he was optimistic about reaching a deal before his scheduled trip to China the following week. He said Iran wanted to make a deal badly, and that if they got there, Tehran can't have nuclear weapons. But Iran was not there yet. Its foreign ministry spokesperson confirmed the proposal was still under review. Tehran's response would be conveyed through Pakistani mediators, but not yet. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Ghalibaf, mocked the Axios report publicly on social media in English, writing that Operation Trust Me Bro failed. He framed the leak as American spin designed to cover the failure of Project Freedom. An Iranian lawmaker called the U.S. text more of an American wish list than a reality. The White House, for its part, acknowledged the Iranian leadership was divided, that forging consensus across the factional landscape of the Islamic Republic's power structure was genuinely difficult, and that some U.S. officials remained skeptical any deal would be reached. They had been down this road before. Optimism announced, talks collapsed, war resumed. The memory of how February 28th had unfolded during active negotiations, during a process that Iran's foreign minister had described as making significant progress, hung over everything. And yet the Pakistani channel was alive. The messages were flowing. The 48-hour window that U.S. officials had identified as decisive was ticking down. On the morning of May 7th, 2026, Iran was expected to convey its formal response to Pakistani mediators. The world, its shipping lanes, its oil markets, its inflation rates, its refugee flows, its calculations of war and survival, was waiting to read 14 lines on one page. The cost of peace, the price of war. May 7th, 2026. The world. 67 days after Operation Epic Fury. 67 days. That is how long it had been since the first Tomahawk missile left its launcher in the Arabian Sea and crossed the horizon toward Tehran. 67 days since the most audacious opening strike in the history of the modern Middle East. Since a supreme leader was killed in his own compound. Since the world's most critical oil choke point was slammed shut. Since the global economy lurched and stumbled and began paying the price of decisions made in Oval Office briefings and Israeli war rooms and Iranian Security Commission meetings. The human cost was not abstract. Thousands had been killed inside Iran, in airstrikes on military installations, in the chaos of retaliatory Iranian fire that failed to distinguish between soldiers and civilians, in the grinding logic of a war that treated infrastructure as a battlefield. Lebanon had been drawn back into conflict. More than 2,000 people had died there. More than 1/6 of Lebanon's entire population had been displaced. Across the Gulf Arab states, billions of dollars in infrastructure had been damaged. Bahrain's only oil refinery had been hit. Qatar's gas liquefaction facilities had been shut down under force majeure. Amazon Web Services facilities in the UAE and Bahrain had been targeted by Iranian cyber attacks and strikes, causing cascading disruptions across the digital infrastructure of the Gulf. In the United States, the average American was not watching satellite images of the Strait of Hormuz. They were standing at gas stations, watching numbers climb on digital pump displays. Gasoline cost 52% more than it had before the war began. Heating oil, airfare, the price of every product that moved by truck. The war in the Middle East had arrived in American kitchens and parking lots and household budgets with quiet, relentless arithmetic. And still, on the morning of May 7th, 2026, there was no signature on the one-page memorandum. Trump had threatened that if no deal emerged, the bombing would resume at a higher level and intensity than before. Iran's hardliners were daring him to do it, calculating that resumed strikes would unify the Iranian public behind the regime and destroy the moderate voices willing to compromise. The moderates themselves were running out of time. Iran's export storage was filling. Its currency was in free fall. The economic clock that the maximum pressure strategy had been designed to wind was approaching midnight. Somewhere in all of this, in the wreckage and the negotiations and the satellite feeds and the economic tremors, were ordinary people who had never voted for a war. An Iranian student in Tehran who had marched in the January protests and begged the world not to bomb the country she wanted to reform from within. An American soldier on a carrier group in the Arabian Sea, watching the stars over the Gulf and waiting for orders that might send him toward fire. A Pakistani diplomat in Islamabad, carrying messages between two nations who could not speak directly, who understood that the gap between war and peace was, at this moment, being measured in words on a single sheet of paper. Trump said the war would be over quickly. He had said it before. But the war had already written its own schedule, its own logic, its own terrible momentum. The question hanging over May 7th, 2026, over the Pakistani mediators and the 14-point memorandum and the men in Washington and Tehran who held the pen, was not whether peace was possible. It was whether either side had the courage, the compromise, and the political will to choose it. History, as always, was waiting to record the answer.